You know, Melissa, it's amazing how when I have a good session, meaning like I run good and I win some money, I can walk away from it thinking, I'm such a god, but of course I've always been a god, and like everyone knows this, and like it's really just unquestionable, and this is just more proof of my excellence and dominance in the hierarchy of poker. Then when I have a losing session, I can walk away thinking, isn't it funny how all these people actually think I'm not shit at this game when I'm entirely hopeless at it? So yeah, such delusion in the short term with poker. Today we're going to talk about how to make sense of our poker session, how to be a bit more objective in reviewing it. But I believe before we get into that topic, you have a story for us that harks back to live tells and being a Machiavellian manipulator at the poker table.
Yes. This was a perfect situation of how to use, in my opinion, how to use like speech play to get someone to call in a spot where they're very close to folding. So we talked about this a couple episodes ago. I believe it was generally an episode on live tells, but we ended up spending like the last 20 minutes or so talking about speech play and how to incorporate speech play into a live game. And this happened this weekend. It was my normal kind of 1-2 game, a player that I really haven't played with that much, but kind of struck me as a very kind of passive, more kind of calculating player than I think most of the most players in the pool. I noticed he was aware of how much money was in the pot. He was aware of pot odds. He seemed to be playing, I guess you could call it like mathematically sound, like he wasn't just tossing money into the pot. So we got into a pot and I turned a straight, and I also had a redraw to a flush on the river, and he bet out. He had bet flop, and then he bet turn. This was a single raise pot, and I had probably about $200 left on top of his bet once I called his bet, and I just shoved because I just felt like it was the right time to do it. I felt like he had a lot of top pair in his range, maybe 2 pair, maybe even some draws. And I just thought there was a good chance that if I waited to the river to shove, it was a good chance that he was probably going to fold if a blank came out. So I jammed, and I could see him counting in his head, kind of his lips moving, looking at the pot, thinking, okay, this is too much money to call. Probably should fold here. He started to move his chips, and I was just desperately looking up and down at him across the table, trying to see if there's anything I could talk about to try and distract his thought process, to interrupt him from folding. And I saw his hat. He was wearing like a baseball cap, and he had a logo of this band, this super obscure band that I haven't listened to since college, called Sound Tribe Sector 9, which is like this very bizarre kind of jam band, kind of electric, I don't know what you would call them. And so I said, oh, is that a Sound Tribe Sector 9 hat? And he just froze, and he went, yeah, how did you know that band? And I said, I didn't think anyone listened to that band anymore. And I was like, I think like you have really good taste. And he was like, looked at me and he smiled and he goes, just for that, I'm going to call. Then he called, the river came out of blank, and I won the pot. And not only was he happy to call and give me his money, but after I dragged the pot, he still was happy to talk to me. And he was like excited that I knew about this music. And I really don't. I just recognized the hat. It was really bizarre, like kind of just something to talk about to interrupt his thought process. But he was so close to folding, and he was like such a kind of, he was more on the nittier side than on the whale side for sure. And I thought, oh my gosh, I got to talk about this on the podcast, because this is a perfect example of what we were talking about, putting it into action. So I was really proud of myself. I still am.
That should be your reaction to anything eventful that happens in your life, though. I need to talk about this on the podcast.
Be careful what you wish for.
So there's a couple of things there.
Yeah.
One is like, any interruption is better than no interruption when you're pretty sure that your opponent's about to fold. Shout out Hoodie Allen, by the way. No interruption. Didn't mean to like steal your song title there, bro. If you're listening to this, I know you play poker. It was a bit of a segue. I also want to say that I like this outcome is amazing. And if you actually predicted this outcome, this is like social genius. This is like really Machiavellian and manipulative and clever, because Yeah, you're like, huge compliment, Pete. Thanks. Because it's funny because before he makes the call, when he's thinking about folding, he's probably thinking losing a pot to this person is more painful, is like too much pain and is too bad a thing and is like too much of a negative. Therefore, even though there's a chance I'm winning and she's bluffing or semi-bluffing or whatever, I'm still going to fold. And you've obviously picked up on that. And then by like forming this positive rapport, you've changed the situation to a win-win for him, where like in his head now emotionally, it's like, if I call and lose, well, at least I'm giving my money to this cool person that knows about this obscure band, and like we've got this rapport now, and that's good. I'm happy to donate to her because she's one of the good ones. She's one of my allies in this game of life, and whatever the brain interprets that as. And then, you know, secondly, like the idea of calling and winning is also win, because then he wins a massive pot. So it really is like now win-lose, no longer, but win-win after that interaction. So that's really funny. Yeah, well done.
Yeah, thank you. I was quite proud of myself, and yeah, it made me smile. It was a good moment. So wanted to bring it up. So for any of you listening who think who thinks speech play is stupid,
screw you.
There's ways to do it. Yeah. So moving on to our topic today. This is a good one because I struggle with this too. Your intro was completely spot on. I totally agree. How a session goes, good, bad, neutral, whatever, absolutely frames how I think of myself, at least in the short term. In fact, I remember I had a losing session on Sunday. That was one of those sessions I played for a while. I played for about 9 hours, 10 hours, I think. And it's hard over the course of a session that long. You know, you remember certain hands, but you also like, it's hard to log hands as being like, put them in the category of like, that was a mistake, or I just got unlucky, or that was, you know, something I need to remember for last time. I'm not one of those people, and I really don't see a lot of them at all in live games who like write down hands. Every once in a while, I'll, put something into my phone if it's a hand that I really want to study and look into and I want to remember. And I find that to be helpful sometimes, but overall, you know, it's hard to kind of go back through a session and pull it apart and think, okay, was that a good session or a bad session, absent the results? And the reason why my session on Sunday was so difficult is because I ran into so many coolers and got into so many spots where I thought, okay, like I couldn't have done anything different. I got my money in good. It was a plus EV move, whatever. But then there were a few pots where it was a little bit closer, and I was like, you know, could I have taken a different line there? Did I, was that a bad call? Was that a good fold, et cetera, et cetera? And so one of the things that I think would be helpful to maybe discuss today would be, what are some ways that we can kind of pull apart a session, that we can kind of go through a session afterwards to kind of get a truer, like a more authentic and real idea of how we should think about that session, and also how we should divorce that or incorporate that into the image that we have of ourselves as being, you know, a good player, or a player that has, you know, maybe not so good or needs work in certain spots, etc.
Yeah, I think divorcing it is like the primary aim, because if we don't divorce the initial emotional impression from our view of ourselves, we end up being this feather in the wind that's just being blown from a good self-image to a bad one, based on factors that are totally, you know, intangible and just nothing to do with anything that's under our control. So that's the first thing to say, that there will always be an immediate emotional impression after a session, and usually that will imprint on our self-image, which means that we'll come away from a session thinking of ourselves in a different way, and that will then have a knock-on effect to the rest of our day or week, or even like year or career in poker or something like that. So when we have a bad session, I think it's incredibly difficult sometimes to separate times we've played badly from times where we just ran badly, from times where it was a hybrid of both. Most situations where we lose a pot, we will have run bad to some extent. So right away, this sort of false dichotomy between did we play bad or did we run bad, as if they're like these mutually exclusive options, I just don't think that's the right framework to really place things in. I think we should always accept that when we lose a pot, we probably didn't run the best, but we should just ask the simple question: how was my play? Did I make any inaccuracies, maybe larger mistakes or blunders there? We can always grade mistakes, talk about a few different severities of error. And by doing that, we can frame the picture in a bit more of a realistic way, where it's not just like we either messed up a spot or we didn't, but that there's some kind of like level of inaccuracy, some deviation from optimal play that we maybe committed or didn't, and we should place it on that scale. So that's the first thing I would say, make it a gradable exercise. I think another important thing is to take a bit of time after the session to not play. Like I had a bad session the other day in my bankroll challenge that I'm doing at the moment, where I dropped maybe 4 buy-ins really quickly, but it wasn't just that. I was also playing really like not great as well. I was kind of annoyed and impulsive and angry and wasn't thinking things through properly and was kind of button clicking. And button clicking for me is still probably easily enough to win at like the 100 NL pool that I'm grinding the bankroll challenge in. So I didn't feel like I was like minus EV in the pool or shouldn't be playing, but I was like, yeah, I'm definitely like throwing away EV here, like compared to playing my A game. And it was funny when I went on my run after that, I'm like running through this grassy lane with stinging nettles and brambles like everywhere, and I'm getting like my legs cut to pieces. This is what happens. The lane like becomes more and more overgrown as we move from like February, and I'm on a run and I'm like, I like this little lane. It's good that this is here. I don't have to run on the road. Then it gets to June and I'm like, why are my legs bright red like after the run and burning for hours? So anyway, I was like enduring that physical pain, but it was funny what was going on in my head, because I was also like, Pete, you're like a complete sham of a poker player. Like, you're really terrible. The way you played that pocket sixes hand was so bad that it's appalling that you're even in this position. It's insane that you think you can teach other people when you would play a hand that bad. So here I am, absolutely degrading myself to the point of like actually calling myself like a phony or like an imposter based on one hand. One hand, which admittedly I butchered, but it was because I was four tabling. I missed a detail. Like, I missed a simple detail. Like, if you don't notice the stack size of someone on your table because you're four tabling, and then you make a blunder based on that one omission, okay, does that really mean that you don't understand the game deeply anymore because you missed one detail? Of course not. But here I am on my run thinking you shouldn't be playing the game. Like, you just can't play good poker and stuff like this. It's like, where does this voice come from, man? Like, who is this guy? He's like less reasonable than me when I'm angry at a student for playing badly. That's really bad. That's really saying
That's
something.
really bad.
Yeah, you've been on the end of that. You probably know what it feels like. So it's weird that we're willing to beat ourselves up so badly if we let ourselves do it. And I think like any bully, our internal self after a session needs to be reined in and they need to be diffused. So when I'd run a bit further and I was like on my way back, and like the adrenaline had built up and like the good chemicals were going that happen when you exercise, I started to feel level-headed again. Yeah. And I was like, that was so stupid. Like, as I was coming back down Stinging Nettle Avenue for the second time towards my house, I was like, shit. When I was going the other way, I could almost see the me going the other way that had just come out the house and was running up this lane. And I was like, that guy's a fucking bully, man. He had no idea what he was talking about. The only reason I played sixes badly was because I didn't notice the stack size of the player that had opened. That can happen when you're four tabling. That was really the heart of it. And then I made one further mistake, and it was a calamity of a hand based on those two things. But that was the only hand I really butchered, because I thought about all the other hands as I was like, you know, on the second or third K or fourth K of the run. So now I'm on the fifth K of the run, and I'm like, yeah, none of the other hands were even that bad. Like, maybe some small inaccuracies. I started grading the mistakes like I was talking about. And then by the time I got back to the house, I was like, no, I'm quite a good poker player. Like, I'm still really confident in my ability, and I'm going to go upstairs now, make a video, and enjoy the experience and be proud of myself. And my self-image was back to the realistic version of it that sees me for what I am. So the flip side of that is good sessions. But before I ramble on any further, have you had any similar experiences, Melissa, where you've had a session that's gone badly and you've viewed yourself differently? What was that like? And then maybe after that, we can move on and talk about the flip side, which is like the overconfidence and ego explosion that can happen when we run good.
Yeah, I definitely have. It's funny, you know, you mentioned a lot before this, you know, how hard you are on yourself when you make a mistake and you know, kind of like you beat yourself up. I think your inner bully, your inner voice is definitely more is crueler than mine. Yeah, I definitely have an inner voice too, but yours is much more like crueler. Mine is much more kind of paranoid in a sense. So like my tilt, my feeling of like desperation after a bad session is not, I'm an idiot, what are you doing? You're a terrible poker player. It's, you're not good enough to accomplish what you want to accomplish in this game in the long run. So like your losing sessions are worse than overall are worse than what, the kind of, I would call like, middle of the road to, maybe a little bit higher than that, maybe like mid stakes player, et cetera, would be having. So like what you're experiencing is worse than what the typical player experiences. You're somehow separate from that. You're abnormal. So my thought process is very much like, almost like it reminds me like in high school, some of the emotional highs and lows that I think most kids probably go through, but I definitely went through it, where you feel like I'm different, I'm an alien, I'm not like everyone else. Like this is I can't relate to anyone. That definitely is, some of those same emotions come up in me when I'm in that position post session after a losing session. So I'm not necessarily dealing with a voice calling me an idiot. I'm dealing with a voice saying, you're different, you're an alien, you're not someone, what's happening to you is different than what's happening to everyone else. And it's because you are different. So you're causing, all of these problems, which is a very, very, it can be very alienating, and it can turn poker from a game that I love and that I have a lot of devotion to, almost a kind of, at times, a kind of religious devotion to, in the sense that I just want to learn more about it and get better at it. It turns it into a kind of exercise in alienation, which is very, very disheartening. And so that's that's what happens for me. If it's, which is, you probably know that about me already from having known for so long, but yeah, I wanted to ask you though real quick, have you ever been so kind of tilted, or have your mind be so full of this kind of angry narrative that you can't exercise? Because I've had that happen, to where like, I'm like, oh, I should go out and like run to take my mind off of everything. And like, I get a half mile in, or half K in, for UK listeners. And I just stop, and I have to like walk. I have to just, I mean, I can keep moving. I'm not like depressed and like I don't get into a fetal position or something, but I have to keep, I can't bring myself to kind of exert enough energy and to kind of put the effort into running. I have to just kind of stop and walk and just kind of, continue to move forward, but do it with as little strain as possible.
Interesting. So you stop after like 912 yards. That's what you're telling me sometimes.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's right.
So no, that's never happened to me. That's totally alien to me. Like I can't imagine doing that, because like the way I'm wired, and this might even be like something to do with gender to some extent. There could be like a correlation here, where like males are slightly more wired to maybe fight and like embrace like exercise in times of adversity, whereas perhaps like the female is more wired to do that less frequently, or in less common situations only. So without getting into like a huge debate about that, I think it's fair to say that I've never experienced that. I'm more likely to run harder and faster and more angrily because of adversity. I'm more likely to really cause myself pain, and I have this weird masochistic thing sometimes, where when something has been going badly, like let's say poker has gone badly and I need to go out and run or something, or I've just had a bad morning in general, or work hasn't done what it's meant to do, or someone's let me down or something like that, so I'll go out, I'll run, and I'll be like, yes, suffer, like actually suffer, mate, like I hope you suffer right now, because it might actually make things go better for you if you suffer. And that's really weird. I don't know what it's about. I think it's about like overcoming adversity through pain, through like embracing hardship or something, but it's the opposite of what you're talking about.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's consistent with your kind of, you have an inner kind of paternalism, an angry father or something. Not to get into like a Freudian thing, but
It's funny because my parents, when I was growing up, were both very lenient with me in different ways, like very different ways. Like
well,
my
that's exactly what yeah, that's exactly why
Yep.
you're craving what you never had
Yep.
in subconsciously.
And I have to do it for
So, like,
myself, which is hard, man.
yes.
It's hard. Yeah.
We shouldn't go any further, especially on the Freudian thing, because it gets weird. It
I'm
gets
up for
weird,
being
weird
therapized
really
on
quick.
podcast any day, Melissa. Don't worry.
I'm not a professional by any means, but I have read some Freud, and it is interesting how it all goes back to your parents, and you overcompensate for what you didn't get when you were young.
Yep.
But it gets very strange, especially when you get into anything involving sex or gender. Anyways,
Yep.
moving on. What was the question you asked me that before I went off on my tangent about alienation and existential dread?
Well, I was going to ask you about the positive sessions, but maybe before we get to that, yeah, let me come in on this idea of alienation.
Yeah.
Because I actually didn't know that about you. Like, I didn't know that was the way you were wired, like in school and stuff. Like, I knew you always wanted to like really overachieve, and you were terrified of like not doing really well and stuff like that. I didn't know the part about like just feeling you were totally different. But I think that's, as Peterson might say, if I can do my impression for a second, he might say something like, well, I mean, being an adolescent female and being worried about your self-image, these are type identical, actually. He'd say something like that about it. And yeah, I think it's the same for like, not quite to the same extent, but it's similar for teenage boys and stuff growing up as well. Like, we have those moments too where we're like, shit, like I just don't fit in. And it's funny how, for you, poker brings you back to your most sort of primordial childhood insecurities, almost your adolescence insecurities. And it does the same thing for me, because like, what was I like when I was a kid and I malfunctioned? What was it like when things went badly for my psyche when I was a kid? You can probably guess. It was a tantruming brat. It was like this kid, like say me and my dad, we go to like the pitch and putt. Do you know what pitch and putt is, Melissa? It's like in between,
like miniature golf.
It's in between miniature golf and full golf. So maybe you have like you have like a pitching wedge and you have like a putter, and the holes are all like yards again, 80 yards long, something like that. That probably won't mean anything to you. So you're playing a bunch of par twos or par threes, basically, if it was real golf.
So and like a half mile.
No idea. Maybe.
We're making measurement jokes.
A golf hole that's half a mile? That's a bit
No,
much,
I don't
right?
even know. It would be like maybe a quarter mile.
Yeah.
I don't know. We're not on the metric system. So,
right.
You know, I can't, I'm lost. I'm alienated. Thank you.
Again.
Again.
You're always alienated, Melissa. God, what's wrong with you? Stop being alienated all the time. So we'd go to the pitch and putt, and I'd look forward to it like all morning. Like, yeah, we're going to go play golf, like get like a real club this time, not just a putter. And then I couldn't really play golf because I was like a 9-year-old kid. I didn't know how to play golf. So I'd hit like bad shots. My dad would hit mostly bad shots as well, but not quite as bad because he was an adult that didn't know how to play golf. And then I would like throw the club miles up into the air, and it would like dangerously land, and we'd both have to run out of the way and stuff like this. And like the minute I'd done that, it was like, okay, now I've like poured the soup all over the table. I've thrown the cake on the floor and stomped in it. I've like been a little brat. My image is now that of an incompetent, helpless, wild, tantruming child. And like with that self-image, it was then impossible to enjoy the rest of the day. Because even if I then wanted to enjoy the day, it was like, you can't, because you've just let the cat out the bag and you've acted in that manner. So now you're stuck in this mode of being a complete little brat for the rest of the day, whether you like it or not. And I still do that today sometimes as well. If I like lose my shit about something, it takes me a long time to regain the adult self-image. So in the same way that like when poker treats you badly, you tend to retreat into like this, I'm an alien, I'm different from everyone else, I don't fit in, and therefore I'm not going to be able to achieve what others could achieve. I go down the road of, I am a useless, out of control brat that can't control himself, and I don't deserve anything because I've not acted with enough good behavior to deserve anything. So if I tilt off a stack at poker, it's very rare that I actually legitimately angrily press the call button or anything like that these days. Very rare. But if it does happen, I'm now a kid that's kicked over the birthday cake and is stomping all over it. I'm now like furious. So I just wanted to note that correlation, that when poker goes badly, because it is such an emotive thing, it's such a competitive thing in which we invest so much of ourselves, it may bring us back to this primordial sort of the first way in which we suffered mentally. It may take us back to those same patterns. It feels like that's what's going on.
Here. Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes total sense. And I think where my my kind of thought process goes, I don't have that, like I said, I don't have that kind of bully, angry parental voice in my head, but I do have a kind of like a kind of spiraling, um, almost like a desperation. So like I have to, I am constantly I have to rein myself back in. And this is something that I've dealt with for a long time, which is, um, something goes wrong. Instead of just seeing it as an isolated incident for what it is, I think things are going to continue to go wrong. This is the first domino in a series of dominoes that will end in utter disaster. And so it's very hard for me to see the future as changing for the better. So we talked about optimism and pessimism in a previous episode, and we talked about a lot of the pitfalls of being pessimistic. And I said I'm naturally pessimistic. It's true, and this comes into play times 10 when I've had a losing session, because I then think to myself, my next session is going to be a losing session, and then that session is going to be a losing session, and then pretty soon my bankroll is going to be ground to dust, and I'm going to have to come up with another plan for my life. And it sounds extreme when I'm talking about it, and even a little bit absurd, but in my mind, that's a very logical thought process. It's not logical objectively. It's not an objectively logical thought process, but in my mind, it feels like the most logical thought process. So like, just as we are, we've evolved to avoid a dangerous situation, don't walk down that dark alley, your kind of spider sense is going off. That's how I feel. Like the future is just a dark alley, and I should just kind of be very extremely cautious, or I should avoid it altogether. And so that is my post losing session mindset. Now, that doesn't happen every time, but I have a losing session, but it does happen a lot. And it did happen this weekend for sure, when I had 2 losing sessions in a row. And I think it's harder for me to kind of extract from that what is the reality of the situation. So like, for instance, going back to, okay, what are some hands that I could have played differently? Maybe I ran bad, but could I have gotten to a certain street differently? Could I have, maybe made a different decision earlier on in the hand? A good example of this is Friday night. I played a pretty late session, and I was kind of getting ready to go. It was close to 2 a.m. and I was dealt pocket queens on the button. Under the gun was a very inexperienced nitty player who hadn't played a lot of hands. He opened from under the gun, which should have been a major red flag to me right there, but it didn't register. And, I 3-bet him. He flats. The flop comes out, all low card, a 10 high flop. I raise, he jams. I thought, well, maybe he's got aces, kings here, but I'll call because, he had played a few hands kind of crazy in the past. But my thought process was all messed up. It wasn't correct. And of course, he had flopped a set, pocket tens, which is my nemesis. I always lose to pocket tens.
You do.
And I ended up I didn't get stacked, but I ended up paying him off just in a completely ridiculous fashion. And that was kind of how I left the session. And I remember driving home at 2 a.m, which is the worst time, when the streets are empty and it's dark and you're the only one on the road, and you're like, and I thought to myself, well, if I can't pick up on those kinds of, obvious tells, if I can't fold in that situation, then, I am just absolutely, I'm pursuing something that is going to just destroy me in the end. Like I'm essentially embarking on a journey that is going to lead to ruin. And that was kind of what I drove home with and had to then go to bed thinking about, which was not pleasant and didn't lead to the best sleep. In fact, it led to an awful sleep. So anyways, now in the cold light of day, a couple of days later, I definitely see it was a mistake, but I don't think it was that. It's not the end of the world. It just happened. It was late. I was tired. Ideally I would have been able to kind of play that hand better, but there were some external factors that went on that, just made that happen, and it was a mistake. Yeah. And I'm a human.
Yeah. And there's so many times that you can play worse than your average game without it affecting what your average game is. Like if your average game is level B and then you never played level C, well, it wouldn't be B anymore because you play A sometimes, right? So in order to have an average game of B level, you have to play a C or D game sometimes because, hell, you're going to play an A game sometimes and that's going to drag it up. So, yeah, I think we're all allowed to perform below our normal standard, and we should all have a certain tolerance for that happening. And while we should aim not to underperform compared to our average or what we strive to do, we should still be tolerant for some amount of, okay, that was a blip. That was me having like one of my moments where I just play a bit worse. You know, you've even said, why did it happen? Well, you were getting ready to leave. It seems like you should just leave 5 seconds before you actually have the thought of leaving. If you could just play one less hand, it feels like you wouldn't get stacked so much based on recent history, but that's just a variance pattern, don't worry.
Yeah, I know.
Pocket Aces hand from the other week comes to mind.
I always get these big pocket pairs just as I'm about to leave, and I'm always on the button too. It's like, yeah.
I wouldn't have got stacked, but I was on the button, so I had to.
I was on the button, yeah. I had to play it. I'm not gonna fold if I get dealt a pocket pair and I'm about to leave. And my chips are in a rack. I'm just not gonna fold. I'm sorry. I'm not afraid of that.
Yeah. It's random variance, don't be. But yeah, you can see that like you were tired, like maybe the reads were there, but that part of your brain that would normally see that and be like, okay, the way he's behaving here, the way this player has been, while a normal player might have pocket jacks in this spot and I might have a value beater, perhaps your read was that this guy is just not going to raise your flop bet with pocket jacks. They're just not that kind of player. They're way too nitty. And therefore their range really does fall down as like a set of 10 slow played kings or slow played aces like most of the time. And then it's incredibly difficult to see how the flop is anything but a bet fold if you do have that read. But that's quite a rare read to have, and to actually have the conviction to pull the trigger on a read that would really only apply to a very small subsection of pool, you have to be in a place where you can access a lot of conviction. Well, what is conviction? It's the ability to follow through on something fairly difficult when it would be easy to take another expedient route that is not following through on that difficult thing. So let's say that conviction is the ability to pull the trigger on something that isn't easy. And when can we do that? Well, when our willpower is higher, when we have more energy available, not at 2 a.m. at the end of the night. But one thing I want to say to you, Melissa, right, is your drive for poker and the effort you put into it, the dedication, you're basically like married to poker right now. Like, I can't even imagine what that would be like, because these days I very much separate my poker life, my work life from my social life and my family life and all that kind of thing. And you just seem to be like, you know, you've obviously got other things going on. You've got like your normal job, and then you're just cramming so much poker into like your free time or your non-professional time. Or that's the wrong word, but your other profession, basically, right?
Yeah.
That it's really admirable, and that's what it takes. The reason that I'm being really supportive about this is that is exactly what it takes. Nobody can just rock up to this game and be like, oh, well, you know, I had a nice session last week, so I'm just going to keep playing, and I'm going to, you know, grind my way to all these lofty goals and expectations because I'm running good right now and I feel invincible. And this is the whole ego tilt that comes from running good in a session, which we're going to move on to really shortly. But I think what you've got is just this brute force, stubborn dedication to the cause, a passion for the game, which you absolutely need. Like, you can't get by in this game without a shit ton of passion. Speak to anybody that's made this game their career. If it ever became mundane or flat, or they weren't excited by it, they just wouldn't be able to do a good job anymore. They might turn up and go through the motions, but they wouldn't really be learning, improving, and playing their A game very frequently at all. So for all of the times when you feel like an alien and feel like the downswing will continue and it will spiral out of control and you're going to hit rock bottom, or maybe like nobody that doesn't fold queens there deserves to like make it in the long run, like when you have thoughts like that, just remember that you have something that most people don't, and that is like this raw passion integrated with a raw dedication. So not only do you have inspiration, which is the thing that kickstarts the engine of grit, and the grit engine is the thing in my book Poker Therapy that I use as the diagram to explain what keeps good dedicated poker players in the game long term for long enough such that they can reach their goals and actually succeed. Inspiration is like the thing that kickstarts that locomotive engine. So it's inspiration into motivation, into discipline, into goal attainment and setting. So basically the inspiration is like, why am I doing it? Like, why am I making this such a big part of my life? Why am I filling my free time with this? Oh wait, it's because I really want this thing now or in the future, or both, right? And you've got that drive, you've got that raw thing that you're craving from poker, and you really want to be, you know, you want poker to be a big part of your life now and in the future. Then you have motivation, which is the get up and go to actually do it. There are loads of people who have inspiration but not motivation, right? It's like when you went out for your run and you're too demoralized and you
Mm-hmm.
stop. You had the inspiration to go for the run, but you didn't have the motivation to actually do
Mm-hmm.
it once you got into that context. Again, that's alien to me. But we're
Mm-hmm.
different. And then you have discipline. Well, discipline comes from high willpower and it comes from high motivation. I think your discipline for turning up and putting in the graft, like putting in the hours, is phenomenal. I think sometimes maybe you're lacking a bit of discipline when it comes to how you play towards the end of sessions when your willpower is low, like that sort of discipline. But we can work on that. And then you have goals and you're achieving some of them and some of them are in the future, and your goals are linked to your inspiration, and your discipline is being used to help you follow your goals. So you actually have the grit engine, these 4 things to recap: inspiration, motivation, discipline, and goals. Imagine them at 4 corners of like this engine powering each other. You have that down. And so I really think, like, for all of the doubt that goes in, you could always remind yourself that mental game wise, you actually have all of the components for success. Technically, yeah, that's another journey. That's another slog. I think you can do that too. Like we've talked about that before in coaching. But mental game wise, you've got all the components. And I think that's something to remember. Hell, maybe you are a bit of an alien, like in that way, but it's the best kind of alien because you've got the perfect combination of these things that you need to succeed in such a difficult environment that most people who try it simply don't have. So I felt like I wanted to reassure you a bit there, and I wanted to sort of speak to the you who was driving home at 2 a.m. having all of these thoughts, because I feel bad for her, because I feel like, while she's not like a horrible parental bully, like my horrible inner child / parent, whatever it is, overgrown ogre thing in my head, it's still quite, I don't know, passive aggressively demeaning to yourself in some ways. And like, I don't think that's fair. I think you've got a lot going on there mentally. That's good.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really nice of you to say. I appreciate that. And it's very helpful too, because I do it's more or less a solo pursuit for me. I haven't yet gotten to the point. I've never been a person that can kind of like work in a group, like a group setting. And so I don't really work with other people. And so it's really nice to have that feedback. So I really appreciate that. And I guess maybe that's a good way to segue, or a good time to segue into like the opposite feeling like you're a god after you run really well. I'll start on this because I've had this experience too. So for me, after I've had a really good session, poker feels like the easiest thing in the world. It really does. It feels like, how do I not win all the time? Like, this is so simple. If I only just played like this every time, the future would be paved in gold. And it feels like this is, I guess the really dangerous part is, it feels for me like, okay, this is correct. This should be the result. This is very much the correct result. We're back on the right track. Like, it's almost like your car is broken down and you're, sorry to use this analogy because I know you're suffering from, sorry.
Oh my God, Melissa, why that?
I just thought it was the first thing that came to my mind.
Okay, fair.
Okay, I'll use it. I'll not use a car analogy.
Use it, it's fine.
Your car's broken down on the side of the road and you finally get it fixed and it's running again. And you get back into the driver's seat and you're able to continue on your journey. That's what it feels like. It feels like, this is okay. The car is working. What's the car supposed to do? The car is supposed to drive. It's now driving again. It was broken down. It was doing what it's not supposed to do. Now it's fulfilling its purpose. Me as a poker player, I was losing the last couple sessions. Now I'm winning, and I've won 3 or 4 in a row, and my graph is just going up. This is what's supposed to happen. I'm a poker player. I'm good. I'm, all of the work I put into it is paying off. Okay. Blah, blah, blah. And everything is right with the world. That's the kind of winner's tilt, if you want to say, that I go on. In game, this can manifest itself as playing really well, like a game, with a feeling that the wind is at my back and I have this kind of sixth sense for what's going on. Sometimes I even have a sense of like, I can anticipate what players are going to do. I have a kind of, we talk about a kind of Machiavellian control over the game. I definitely feel that way. And that can be a good thing because it can cause me to play really well, or it can be the kind of thing where I, maybe overplay hands, or I fold in spots that are clearly not folds. Worst case scenario is I have a huge stack of chips in front of me and I think, this is like a couple times this has happened to me where I think I've never won this much in a session before. I should kind of lock it down a little bit because this is like something I want to celebrate. I can cash out now and then I can go celebrate with like a nice glass of wine and buy myself a nice dinner and like, and I don't think that's actually a bad thing, by the way. I think that every once in a while we should reward ourselves for you know, when things go well. But those are some of the things I experience when I'm, you know, after a good session. The other thing I'll say, and I'll just kind of throw it back to you after this, but the other thing I'll say is I will sometimes have a hard time. Like I'll be able to acknowledge that I'm running well. So I'll be like, okay, like the last, you know, I hit a flush on the Turner River the last like 3 hands, right, in one session. And or like you're like, oh yeah, I hit a set like 4 times today or something like that. And you think, God, that was pretty lucky. But you also think like, well, that's kind of what's supposed to happen when you have pocket pair pre-flop. And the voice in my head is like, no, that's not there's nothing that's supposed to happen. But it's like, what? Then the other, you know, side of me thinks, well, you know, it was plus EV. And so therefore I'm being rewarded because I'm getting just paid off. I'm taking a plus EV move. So I'm just getting, you know, back. I'm getting this nice return on my investment. That's what's supposed to happen. So anyways, all of those things kind of go through my head after a winning session and or a couple of winning sessions.
Yep. Doesn't sound that bad. It doesn't sound like your winner's tilt or your self-image when you're winning is anywhere near as deluded or destructive as your self-image when you're losing.
Yeah.
And I think for me, it's kind of similar. Like when I win, and I had a really good session this morning where I was building some hands to record the video that I recorded this afternoon. And I probably won like 3 or 4 stacks like relatively quickly just by flopping stuff and getting paid by fish and things. Nothing like major, nothing even that interesting, just a bunch of like really standard instructed bread and butter spots. But at the end of the session, I remember like walking downstairs, and this didn't last long, but I had this glow for about like 5 or 10 minutes. Even though I don't really care about the money, I just like the feeling of winning. So I was like strutting downstairs, and I was just like, yeah, I'm god of poker, like clearly one of the best to ever do it. Like I wasn't thinking these thoughts consciously, but if you had asked me, Pete, do you want to say a few words about like your victory there? Like how do you think you did it? And like you interviewed me like a sports person, I would probably have attributed much more of it to my own skill than I would now, like a couple of hours later, where I look back and I'm like, man, at one point I was just making straights and flushes and sets on like all 4 tables at the same time against fish.
Yeah.
So it was like, well, how did you only win 3.5 buy-ins? Okay, I got stacked a couple of times too, so that's probably why. Yeah. But it's like, why didn't you make more? Like, that's what I'm thinking now. Yeah. It's like, did you really maximize enough there, Pete? Like, are you sure? But at the time when I'm winning, I'm just too much like, life is as it should be. I'm like an alpha supreme beast and everyone else is below me. I'm at the top of the hierarchy. All the good chemicals are running through my brain. And I think there's something incredibly primal and natural about that, to feel like the kind of queen bee or like the ringleader of the game you're playing in. You just feel very much like the supreme ruler in those situations. Well, I do anyway. And that's natural. Like when you get better results than everyone else around you, we're definitely trained to act that way, because the way to capitalize on being a supreme human within a tribe of humans at something is to know that you are, so that you can then do that thing, you know, more, so that you can then benefit and your tribe can benefit by you doing that thing more and being the one in the tribe who does that thing the most because you're the best at it, right? It's like a very natural, I guess, libertarian idea where like the people who are good at things naturally do that thing because they want to and because it's good for society, and then society flourishes, something like that. So I think the reactions I have there are very normal. They come from just being like a leader type. I just have like a leader type personality, always have had, but they're dangerous in a sense as well, in that they create this unrealistic sense of my own worth, which at times holds me back from actually working on my game and acknowledging where my deficiencies are. Because the other day, when I was running through the stinging nettle place, getting stung and getting bramble thorns stuck in my shins and stuff like that, I was actually going through hands and I was doing like the heavy lifting. I was like, in that spot, it may have been slightly better to blah, blah, blah. And I was going through combos and I was like weighing up ranges in my head, literally replaying hands in like a mental replayer as I was doing this run. And by the time I got back, as I said to you, I was kind of like, yeah, there was only like 1 or 2 spots I actually got wrong there. And I've learned other things and I've consolidated neural connections about some of the other spots that I was in there. So I think for me, one of the dangers of this, like I am the untouchable king kind of self-image after a winning session, is I don't actually see where I truly am. And there's this old saying that if you don't know where you are, then you can't get to where you need to be because you don't know your starting point, right? Google Maps can't tell you how far it is from X to London if you don't know where X is, right? It can't even tell you which direction you should travel. So that's problematic. And I think that what I could do is try and rein it in a bit more and try to like maybe enjoy it for a shorter amount of time and then still be critical of winning sessions. But I can tell you, when I'm in a winning session, the last thing I want to do or feel like doing is going through and finding flaws. In a losing session, I don't want to do it either, but there's more of a sense of duty that like, okay, I just sucked there and I have to go and correct it. But in the winning session, the last thing I want to do is be like, I won, however, I blundered here, here, and here, even though I won stacks. That's no fun.
Yeah. No, it's not. And it's so funny too, because trying to kind of pick apart variance, separate the variance from the play is actually, I think, very difficult. And at least it's very difficult for me. And the reason is because variance is multifaceted. There's different types of variance. So there's like, maybe you could call it like personal variance. So the variance of like what happens to you, the cards you're dealt, in the position you receive them, kind of thing, like where you're sitting, what time of day, all of those things, how you're feeling, that's kind of internal variance, personal variance. And then there's this kind of external variance that has to do with you getting cards and then someone else getting cards at the table that plays back against you so that you get sufficient action to feel like, your cards get paid. Like, and those two things have to match up. And then you also have the variance of the board, what cards actually come out on the board. So, those are things that are going on. But one of the things that I think is a recipe for at least me personally, for like a really difficult mental game challenging session is when I have a combination of like going, card dead for a while and then finally getting big cards and then everyone folds, getting no action, watching a game full of fish who are splashing around in almost every pot, throwing chips back and forth across the table, stacks going up, stacks going down. And then when I finally want to get in, people fold, or there's just not, and it's not because of me personally, it's because they're just not, the hands don't meet in their minds this like bare minimum threshold, which is already pretty low. So they don't play the hands, or you get to the flop and they just fold. This has happened to me a lot, not a lot, but it seems to happen often in the last couple of months. It's been part of, I think, what's been a larger kind of downswing of a year for me. But anyways, I think thinking back on a bad session, it's, you have to think to yourself, okay, there was variance involved in this hand, but there was variance involved in this session, but there was also, what was out of my control, what was within my control. And so I always try and remember, like, yeah, it was a tough session. You made some mistakes, but you also did a lot of things that were really good. And what were those things? Remaining disciplined pre-flop, not putting yourself in situations with a kind of desperation because you haven't played a hand in 45 minutes, not trying to kind of get action in spots where it's going to be just negative EV unless you get lucky. This is going to sound maybe a little bit pretentious or whatever, but not lowering yourself to the habits of the other players at the table. And that's not to say that, people play in their own way, right? And people come to a poker game with various motivations. I know what my motivations are. I know who I am. I know what I'm trying to accomplish. Not forgetting that, not losing my identity and my mission in this thing, not allowing those things to get clouded. That can be an incredible victory sometimes. And so sometimes I walk away from a session where I've lost money and I think that was a good session. That was a good session because I conquered these kind of challenges of running bad, going card dead, not getting any action, all of these things that were kind of combining to kind of sink this session. I resisted that. And that kind of feeling is actually, in some ways, I think the most productive for me, because I'm not on winner's tilt because I haven't walked away with, I haven't won 2 or 3 stacks or 4 or 5 buy-ins. but I'm not on any kind of loser's tilt because I haven't lost 3 or 4 buy-ins and I haven't just been demolished. I'm just kind of right in the middle where I felt like I've kept in control of my mental game. I played the hands that I was dealt, as well as I could have, and there was just kind of nothing there. So it leaves me with the appetite to go back and study more, to come back and play another day. But it also doesn't, leave me so elated that I'm, not in reality.
Yeah, it's so rare for someone to have a healthy relationship between themselves, variance, and their poker career. Like so many students of mine, they will absolutely base their self-worth at the time on the most random things, and they'll base their view of my coaching sometimes, at least their sort of emotional impression of it, on what variance has done to them as well. So like it's really common for a student to send me a graph after like one session and they've played like 7,000 hands, which maybe live is quite a lot when you have a big win rate and a lower standard deviation for your variance, but online is basically nothing, where win rates are smaller and the variance is a bit higher hand to hand. So they'll post like a 7,000 hand graph where they're winning and they'll be like, man, I know it's a small sample, but... And I'll just be like, no, but. Like, this means nothing. Like, 7K honestly means like very, very little. Okay, sometimes when they fix like a hemorrhaging red line, or they've improved the stat, or they've improved the tendency, or they post some hand examples, sure, I'll entertain that. But sometimes when they're just posting a graph and saying, you've really sorted my game, man, I can't believe I didn't come to you sooner, I'm so glad we started this process, I'm just like, uh-oh. Well, now, when you start running bad... Is that my fault, since I'm like your savior and I'm to thank for your 7K hand upswing where you won 18 buy-ins? What happens if you lose 12 buy-ins tomorrow? Is that my fault? And usually it's not, and they're not going to even say that or think that. But yeah, there's a lot of mistaken correlation for cause going on in poker. So sometimes you can have a correlation between a good self-image and winning that is causal. So winning causes you a good self-image, and then you have a correlation between a good self-image and you actually, this is causal as well, so feeling good about yourself because you're winning and being full of like positive emotions, but then a judgment about yourself as a good poker player. That's causal, in that like the good feeling and the good emotions give you an impression that you're good, but it's not actually logically valid. And then when we zoom out, what's actually going on here is that good variance is making you think you're good, and it sort of goes through this intermediate point of your good emotions and your good self-image, right? As like the sort of thing that relays it. So I really think that that's a danger, in the same way that like the inverse is a danger, like just feeling like we're no good when we're losing and we're good when we're winning. It's so hard to break that cycle. It's so hard. And that's an interesting point you raised about the break-even sessions sometimes being the most useful, because they are the most translucent glass. They're not opaque. They're not distorted by this false mistaking of correlation for cause that happens in extreme cases of misfortune or extreme cases of good fortune. So yeah, it's a really interesting point.
Yeah. And I think too that the difficult thing with live play too is, you're playing in a pool, people know you have this, you have different histories with each player. And you also see other players at the table who, you may think are, from your perspective, running really well. Every time there's a few players that I play with, like, I feel like every time I see them, they have a stack of chips and they just always seem to be winning. And, you have to interrupt this thought process. At least I do. And I have to, constantly remind myself, like, that doesn't matter at all. Like, you're here for you and you're in control of you. None of that matters. You don't know anything about what that person is experiencing, or whether that person's up or down, or what's going on with their life, or whether they're on case money, or whether they're what, you don't know what's going on. So it's a constant struggle when you're a competitive person like I am, to go into an arena where you are faced with like visual representations of how well people are doing.
Yeah.
And those visual representations are they're false, and they're false because they mean that person literally in that moment has X amount of chips, and that person can pick up and exchange those chips and walk out, whatever. That's true. But it says nothing about the larger picture. It says nothing about them as a player, but it also, more importantly, says nothing about you. And that is what is, I think, really important when it comes to digesting and interpreting and going over and decompressing from any kind of a session, is saying, what does this tell me about me? What, not what does this tell me about variance? Not what does this tell me about, my future 10 years from now, or, my self-worth as a human being. No, those are all kind of false signals. What does this tell me about me as a player in this one session, making a million different decisions over the course of, maybe not a million different decisions, but many different decisions over the course of X amount of hours? What does this tell me, and what can I learn from it? And I think, just as we kind of wrap up here, I also wanted to quickly touch on, like, what does it mean to learn from something? So, like, a lot of times you hear people say after a session, it was a good session, I made some mistakes, I'm going to go back and I'll learn from them, and it was instructive. Or people will say, like, well, even if you run bad, you can always learn from that. But the question is, what does it mean to learn from something? Like, learn from a situation. In order to learn, I think, in a positive way, in the sense, like, using learning to mean, like, you're in a better place today than you were yesterday because you learned something. First of all, you have to honestly understand what it is you're learning, and what it's telling you, and exactly what happened. So I think a mistake that I make sometimes, and that I made a lot more when I first started playing, but I still make, which is interpreting something as maybe a mistake that wasn't really a mistake, that I then say, okay, well, I learned that I probably should have folded in this spot. And I think early on when I was working with you, I had one of these hands where we went through it, and we, before I really understood a lot of, what was happening with pot odds, you actually broke it down and said, no, this was actually the right call. And so the learning that I brought from it in the 4 or 5 days that had elapsed since the session before I started talking to you about it was, I should just learn to fold in this spot. After talking to you, it was, I should learn to call in this spot. So my point in all of this is to say that the idea of learning is making sure that we're learning the right lesson, that we're not learning the wrong lesson.
Totally. And it's so easy to learn the wrong lesson. Like, I've heard people, even like experienced coaches, talk about poker before and say things like, well, you might call there and you might lose, but you'll certainly learn from it. Like, you won't forget the pain of losing that pot. And it's like, but what if that's a good call? And then you learn not to do it again just because you lost again. You're just variance's bitch. Like, every time you do something like that, you're just allowing variance to have dominion over your growth as a poker player. And that's just never a good idea. So yeah, it's a great question. Like, what is this epistemological secret that we need to crack in order to make sure that our learning from poker is the right kind of learning, and not just guessing or randomly learning based on consequences and variance? And I think it comes down to always technically engaging with a hand, and always pushing away the emotional value judgment that we make about the hand. It's so hard to shake a value judgment, like, bad. So when a student of mine calls the river and loses in a spot where, let's say, he needs 25% equity to call, and when we go through the opponent's range afterwards, we break it down and we say, well, actually, against Pool's range here, it's looking like you're going to have between 40 and 55% equity in a spot where you need 25. Now, how much losing is involved in the process of calling when you're getting 3-1 and only need to win 25% of the time? Well, a good call could involve still like 72% losing and 28% winning. And because 28% winning is more than 25% required equity, it's still a good call, right? Rate considerations aside. So how do we learn from a situation where we're calling, losing, let's say, 2/3 of the time, but we're making a good call, when 2/3 of the time we're getting the reinforcement that we just lost resources, we just lost chips or money or buy-ins or whatever? It's hard. And the only way to get around that is to first take this, what we call, I guess we could say, Melissa, type 2 thinking that's about regret, desire, wishing things had been otherwise. Basically, we place it in the filing cabinet, we lock it away, and we say, I see what you're doing, I don't actually need you, please piss off so I can think about the actual spot. And then we bring out the type 3 thinking, which is like, okay, what's the opponent's range for reaching a spot? Well, I'm analyzing facing a bet So if I'm facing a bet, I need to start by understanding the range that the pool gets to that spot with. If I'm not asking that, what am I actually doing? You know, I had a student who talked to him this morning. Always bring this guy up. He's sick of hearing about himself on podcasts. I think secretly he enjoys it because we joke about it on Tuesdays because we record on the same day. Loyal followers will know this by now. But in some spots, he will fold the river to a certain action sequence because he just doesn't want to deal with like the shame of calling and losing. And in his words, the regret of calling and losing, the ouch I should never have, in the words of poker therapy, about calling and losing. And it's like, okay, so if you let that type 2 type of thought govern your decision solely and make you fold, there is no room for actual reasoning. Logic doesn't even get a look in. And when people say, I learned from that not to call there, it's the worst kind. It's not learning at all. They're just using the word learning. It's the worst kind of drawing of a conclusion possible, because you're just taking what variance did to you, ignoring pot odds, abstaining from a logical analysis, and you're calling it learning. Yeah, huge problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, totally. And that was something that I think that was a big step for me to kind of get out of, I guess you could call it like a beginner mode or absolute beginner mode, was to move out of that pure ouch, it hurts emotional reaction, you know, fear of taking a certain action because of the emotion I will feel. And introducing logic in it is so helpful. And I think for anyone that, you know, maybe this sounds familiar or this is resonating with, you know, understanding the logic part of it, it's like taking a burden off your shoulders. It really is. It's so helpful, because then if you're wrong, or if the person has it, they have it, but you understand that logically it was the correct thing to do, even if you only have that 2, 3, 4%, like you said, you know, of equity that would say this is the right call. That's still the right call, and it's like it gives you kind of an armor against some of these emotions in the moment. So
definitely. And the other thing to quickly add to that would just be that students who, or poker players who aren't that experienced yet, they might not have the right kind of type 1 system set up yet. So type 1 system is like your intuitive, subconscious, A-game kind of mode. And if you've not played poker for a very long time, or you've not studied that formally, you might lack that in a lot of spots. And what that does is it creates a vacuum where your type 2 thinking, which is your desires and fears and anxieties and all of that, can step in and start running the show. So at the early stages of your poker career, as you alluded to, Melissa, it's even more important than normal to make sure that the type 3 thinking, the logic, is mostly what's going on, unless you're just like completely sure that you're in mode 1 and that your mode 1 thinking, your subconscious intuition is doing a good job. But that will be rare at first. It will get more and more common as we become more experienced at poker.
And if you're wondering what we're talking about with type 1, type 2, type 3, this is what we discussed in the last episode. This was kind of it was the last episode, right?
2 episodes ago.
Yeah. 2 episodes ago,
right?
So. Where we talked about the psychology of being bluffed.
Yep.
Yes. Yep. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I encourage you to listen to that episode. And
that's episode 13.
I think this was 13. Yeah. This felt like something that kind of developed organically.
Yep.
And during the conversation, you know, in terms of how to categorize different modes of thinking in a spot where you're facing, generally we were talking about river bluffs, and so I would encourage anyone who finds this interesting to go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already heard it, because it's really great. And I think a really good example of what Pete does well, which is kind of make categorize ways of thinking in a manner that is easily digestible, but also something that you can take with you and that and use at the table as like a toolkit. So not something that is going to require like months of study to get right. It's something that I think you can kind of take with you to your next session and has been pretty useful. So anything else, Pete, before we...
Pete versus troll again? I haven't been trolled. Nothing has happened. Wow. Like for the last 2 weeks, I've just not been trolled. I don't remember a single negative comment. I don't know if I'm just like really pleasing the YouTube audience right now, or whether the trolls have just moved on to bigger fish to fry or something. I don't know.
They may have. Yeah, I was looking at some of your your YouTube videos that you released last week, and I'm kind of scrolling through the comments and being like, these are all so nice. What's going on?
Disappointing.
Something, yeah, disappointing, but that's okay. I'm fine with a troll free episode. I mean, it's good. It was good while it lasted, but I'm more than happy to just have this to be a no troll zone. My attitude toward all things online is that I don't put myself into any environments or expose myself to anything that's going to make my day worse.
Yeah.
So I generally don't. That's not my world at all.
Yeah, it's funny because on Twitter, like I started this thing recently that's been quite successful so far, and it's just like pre-flop, the truth about pre-flop EV, and it's just like a post about like stuff people don't really know about pre-flop, or they're commonly like misconstrued about pre-flop. Things like, what is the EV of ace king by the point where you've opened, been 3-bet, you've 4-bet, and someone's jammed, like it's actually a break-even call-off in early position 6 max, for example. And that brings with it a bit more attention. And I used to have this anxiety with Twitter when I first started using it, that was like logging on and actually being like wincing as if I was about to get hit in the face, because there's just so much like toxicity on Twitter. It's just that kind of medium. But now I think I'm just, I've been listening to podcasts and stuff with people who like make like really charged political content, and like the stuff they have to deal with, like death threats and all this kind of thing. And it's just so much worse than like some guy coming on YouTube and being like, get a new doorbell, Melissa, or being like, oh, Pete, you suck, and your bluff's terrible. It's like why are we even fazed by this? So I think like the more I hear about just how horrible like the internet can be for people in other fields, the more I realize that as much as poker does have like ego mad toxic trolls and people that are deluded about their own ability, it's not as bad. And this is like the kind of content that we make, it doesn't attract a lot of trolls. Maybe we just need to be more provocative to fill this segment of the podcast. So I need to think about it.
Well, maybe next time we'll talk about your the Freudian desire that you have to deal with trolls. Maybe it's an extension of this paternalism, this angry father. You need to be corrected. You need to be yelled at.
It's funny because no one's ever put it to me like angry father before, but yeah, it does make a lot of sense. Maybe I'll actually force you to psychoanalyze me on the podcast at some point. That could be really interesting. But yeah, maybe
that'll be a special episode. All right. Well, this has been a great talk. I hope everyone found it useful and interesting. This is Poker Distilled. We're a podcast. We do it every week. If you like this conversation, please like and subscribe. We're on all podcast platforms. What else? Anything else, Pete? Am I missing?
Not really.
Comment.
Just rate it.
Comment.
Yeah. Talk to us on Discord if you have if you want to discuss the topics any further. And I think that's it for this week.
If you're in the Carrot Corner Discord, but if you're not,
buy courses.
Oh, yeah.
And then you'll be in there.
Buy courses, and then you'll get then you'll get access to the. And I will say the Carrot Corner Discord, speaking of an no troll zone, is a very positive community. It really is great. It's a group of people that are very serious about poker, but at the same time, no one takes themselves too seriously.
Yep.
So I like that as well. There's a lot of humor. There's a lot of just banter, some, as you might say, and a lot of different channels where we talk about a lot of different stuff. And I always enjoy it. And I think I would encourage anyone who wants to get involved with the poker community. It's a really good community to get involved with. And if you go to Carrot Corner and buy a course, you get free access to the Discord for life, right? Or until you get okay.
Unless you say something horrific and then you get booted out, but that's happened like twice or something ever.
Yeah. All right. Sounds good.
All right, Melissa, thanks. That was a cool chat.
Talk to you next time.
Yeah, we'll see you guys next time on Poker Distilled. Bye for now.
Okay.